Hello, you're listening to Future Artifacts FM, a radio show hosted by Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies.
Earlier this year, several radio frequencies were discovered airing a collection of broadcasts. At first, they sounded like regular news stories and interviews. They felt familiar, but also not quite belonging to our present. Slowly, the listeners came to believe that what they were listening to did indeed belong to their world, just not their time. They were looking into the future through the mundane edges of radio recordings and public service announcements. While this material is still being meticulously studied by researchers in various universities and museums, your hosts have managed to gain access to this collection to air a selection of these broadcasts for you, our listeners.
For full disclosure, we will not be sharing this collection with you, as this introduction is based on a fictional event. In this monthly broadcast, Future Artifacts FM, we will present speculative fiction pieces by artists and writers, followed by conversation with hosts Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies. The programme will focus on fictional works intended for broadcast, such as radio plays or fictional interviews, to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future.
So welcome back to our second episode of Future Artifacts. Today we'll be speaking to my co-host Niamh Schmidtke about her work Walkie Talkie to the Waves, which is a radio play consisting of 2 acts, the first being the Irish Sea Committee, and the second act, I Used to Be So Much More Than Space. The work is approximately 15 minutes, and before we go into it, Niamh, do you have anything you want to say about it?
Maybe a little bit of an introduction to my research. So when I was writing this radio play, I was thinking about climate breakdown and ecological futures, and I wanted to use this play to kind of play through some of the politics behind climate policy and this idea of being green. What does it mean? And kind of what's the relationship of like government and nationalism to that? That's sort of the background of what made this work come into existence.
So now we're going to listen to Niamh's radio play. We'll see you back in 15 minutes.
I curl in the way an inviting finger might summon you. I push away. My translucency plays with the sky. I carry the salt wind water. I carry the tide. I carry the people from one coast to another. History has made me political, and politicians make me current towards their respective representations. I am the less wild baby of my Western sibling, neighboring smaller, great spaces, the tool for their gains, unwillingly held as a child's 5 fingers grips a single adult one, their unknown strength, me stooped to one side. Yet, when I pull up, they dangle and cry.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to this inaugural meeting of the Irish Sea Committee. I'm going to do a quick roll call. Dáil, yes, I'm here. Holyrood?
Yes.
Senedd?
Yes.
Stormont?
Here.
Westminster?
Here.
Irish Sea?
Yes, I'm listening.
Great. Straight to business. Why are we here?
Dáil and I are concerned about rising sea levels in the Irish Sea. Our environmental projections are very troubling for the future of coastal regions.
Yes, they've been rising for years, ever since the Gulf Stream started collapsing.
Exactly. Why are we talking about it now?
If we don't act now, Cardiff could be underwater in 5 years, Dublin too, Liverpool and Glasgow to follow, and soon after, London.
Why is my rising bad? You started the process. This is my redistribution amongst you. Why are you only speaking to me now? Whose worlds do you want to preserve?
Whose world? Our world. The people will die. Industry lost. This isn't a disaster movie, it's our lives. My question is, why have you invited myself, Holyrood and Zanette here? Surely this is an EU issue along the coast of the island of Ireland.
We called this meeting because we are all facing consequences along the Irish Sea's coastline that can be collectively addressed.
Also, the EU is funding the Dini wind farm, which won't be finished for another decade. There's nothing left in the budget for ecological engineering until after then. We've used all our carbon credits and offsetting allowances on this project.
And because we don't organise our environmental spending transnationally, you are coming to us. Repeating Westminster's question, why call this meeting? What did you expect would happen?
They're looking for money.
No, we're looking for a partnership.
The formation of the Irish Sea Committee?
Exactly.
What is your proposal, then? Why bring us together?
Land reclamation.
Reclamation of the Irish Sea.
Is that even possible? The Dutch have been having immense problems in the last decade trying to keep their technologies open. Is there even enough gas left for this to even be feasible? Now, I'm not sure how this can fit into our Green New Deal strategy if what you want is a multilateral agreement. The different carbon counting scales between our nationalised systems alone would be a nightmare.
We worked together before on the EU trade border between ourselves and Stormont, and a project of this scale requires a similar level of commitment for a common goal.
Weren't those talks largely a failure? There were riots across Belfast and Derry in 2021.
Yes, but those talks began the communication between Dole and myself.
Yes. You connected each other through me.
And pushed you into independent policy making. Until now.
I don't see how a proposal like this would be possible. Reclaiming the Irish Sea. It seems mad.
We tried a project like this near Edinburgh. It failed because of the North Sea storm surges. What makes you think the Irish Sea would be a better fit?
The North Sea tried hard to regain themselves from you.
It's a more sheltered body of water, only 240 kilometres wide and 210 kilometres long. And it is only those of us here who are involved in how we treat the sea.
But what you are talking about is a major multinational approach. We haven't spoken with one another in years, and many more than those of us in this room are involved in the treatment of the Irish Sea.
Yet, you haven't listened to me in centuries.
It would be great to reopen the ferry routes. There are still people with mixed nationalities across the water. Have you heard about the pirate collectives moving to the economic border zones we drew in the sea?
I don't think we would reopen the travel routes. Closing the cargo ships has been incredibly successful in lowering our CO2 rates and in maintaining national support for our respective Green New Deals.
For once, I agree with Dol.
If that is the case, then I withdraw from this committee as it is not genuinely collective. We do not have the funds or the desire to invest in this partnership.
I must also leave. Your proposal is unrealistic. And I do not want to be in future conversations which abuse our relationship to the sea in the way you suggest. Reclaiming the sea. To who? For what purpose? Our coastlines are changing. Move inland. Rebuild your cities. We already know that this form of engineering won't solve the issues at hand.
But we need to reclaim it for ourselves.
You mean for your EU funding packages? I've seen the plans. This is a coy scheme.
Is this true? Are you scamming us?
No. We want to protect our coastal regions.
In the same way you protected your fisheries by mutating fish and polluting the sea.
That was only what your news coverage said.
No, I have heard enough. This won't work out.
I find it hard to imagine this working without Holyrood and Syned's support. I also withdraw.
Wait. This is our last chance.
Voice becomes distorted over this sea, underwater, through all canals. Do you think the shore crash is enough to drown them out? To outshout an image, blow over text? Pinched from larger bodies, I become a Napoleon. Overcompensating for my stature, not so different from the occupants of glass and steel buildings, plugged away from their oceans, missing the fullness of their currents, feeling every arm stroke and plunge deep, sharp push back, displaced car weight, tidal pull. I used to be so much more than space. Value calculated in wind farm locations, ferry ports, flight traffic.
I used to hate water, couldn't stand the beach. My friends never convinced me to dip in. I didn't like the salt on my skin, and I lived in London, used to, before the Green New Deal policies took effect.
Yes. Our relationship began much later. Strange now that your groups take the name pirate.
For sure, although it was out of necessity. I don't have an English passport, and the carbon taxation collections were organised around passport checks, and the localisation shareholder scheme required nationalised participation.
Carbon taxation? Local what? My currents are unable to follow your language.
Localisation shareholder schemes, they started off as community gardens, extended into communal workshops, and were quite successful, especially in London, where space was a high commodity at the time. Over time, as certain projects became more successful, Westminster scaled up the work, assuring us that this was not green growth, but rather green innovation, and that we were creating a newer and better future.
Why is growth green? I grow blue and pale and dark. It is important to grow and shrink, rise and fall.
Exactly. We were concerned because it was incredibly exclusionary. You could work at any workshop that was attached to your address. However, the waiting lists to join these spaces were incredibly long. After the Nationalism Check Act, you could no longer receive any benefits from the work done at the workshop unless you registered as only being an English citizen.
Why Englishness over Britishness or Europeanness or humanness?
Well, Englishness is important for Westminster. It's how they register you to any nationalised scheme, which in recent years has been every resource required to live. Education, medicine, workshops, energy, the list goes on. My family is made up of immigrants, and we've always carried multiple nationalities, ethnicities, and passports. My mother held 5 passports, trading them depending on which continent she wanted to travel to. But after the legislation against air travel, she slowly stopped renewing them. That and the multiple citizenship tax going up.
I see why you left. There is strength in ambiguity from a state. In touching many coasts, each claiming different Irishness, Welshness, Scottishness, Englishness, Northern Irishness.
This is why we came to you. In your waters, we found space to live in between their borders.
Yes. After they carved me up, invisible lines, I lived at rest.
After the Irish Sea Committee disaster, we knew that living on the border between economic zones was the safest option. The most dangerous part was getting there, making sure the cargo ships were seaworthy, getting our communities together for safety, building the pods, designing the infrastructure. We were future building through care and open-endedness.
I felt you. It was strange to have your group's belly hitting my surface. I tried to help you at first weeks. The sea borders placed in the 2020s hurt me. For the EU and the Deanie wind farm, as though being stabbed. But the knife stayed, and the bleed was fished out.
Thank you. We felt much more at peace after leaving the coast. Finally having a space that was outside of Parliament's jurisdiction. It felt like home, being rocked by waves. Many in my pod weren't so at ease, and life on the Irish Sea was a big adjustment. It's strange for home to be a horizon with no geographic markers. Even now, it's only on a clear day that we can make out the Deanie wind farm in the distance.
It is only hard if you have never lived it before. I can't imagine learning to be still. The patience of geology shocks me. My rocking descent up to the moon, compared with their slow pull down towards the earth.
Five, six,
Just
seven,
Like a metronome, just like
Welcome back to Future Artifacts.
FM.
Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your past 15 minutes. So before I begin with most of my questions, Niamh, I was wondering whether you could introduce some of your research. I know you sort of have given a brief overview, but for our listeners, I think it would be great to have a bit more in-depth knowledge of some of the stuff you were looking into. I know some of your previous work is in response to the financialization of nature within like financial industries. And now this work is in response to the Green New Deal from conversations that we've had previously, which is sort of more situated in political industries. And so I kind of see that you seem to be navigating your research through the relationships with almost kind of like bureaucracy and nature.
Yeah, I think I'm quite interested in how even using the term nature is kind of this almost politicized version of it. So in my view, kind of in saying something is nature, you're saying that it's not cultural, which for me, the two are completely intertwined. There's no kind of separation between the two. And I guess that like centers how I think about bureaucracy in terms of ecology and environment is that it's always trying to translate it into something that it's not, or something to kind of serve a purpose. So in terms of financializing nature, translating nature into a monetary cost. So kind of breaking down the cost of a forest in order to turn it into timber or turn it into something that can harvest CO2 emissions. And then what I was quite interested in coming from that, I guess, relationship between finance and ecology and environment and habitat was, how is politics responding to this? Because on the one hand, it's really influenced by financial structures. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, look at the class of people that generally become politicians, or look at kind of the financial backgrounds of politicians and who their friends are. They're usually within the same kind of social circles. But from that, I guess I started doing research and kind of digging around with how is politics and how are parties sort of navigating people's responses to climate breakdown. If you have a public that's saying, we need to do something about this, what is their response and where does that response come from? Which led me to looking into this thing called the Green New Deal, which is climate policy. But the most significant thing that it does is it tries to funnel money out of fossil fuel industries into renewable energy or into kind of recycling plants. So it's this kind of social, political, climate thing.
Economical, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of combining all these things because sort of before they were always separated, and the Green New Deal tries to pull it together. So it's like, how can we reorganize our politics and our economy to better serve the planet? But one of the issues with that is it uses all of these systems, this kind of economic system that has caused climate breakdown. Kind of, you look at the way the Industrial Revolution sort of plays out and how it started this industry of fossil fuel burning. And then you think that that same kind of format of economics that's existed for this amount of time is also going to be able to then kind of undo all of that, which I guess is where I started with my thing of looking at the Green New Deal and being like, this seems a bit weird.
Yeah.
And from that, I read this book by Anne Pettifor, who's quite a prominent kind of UK economist. And she wrote this book called The Case for the Green New Deal. And in it, she talks a lot about localization. So we all eat local organic vegetables. We have our own allotments. We make our own clothing. We serve local industry only. And on the one hand, it sounds really cozy and really great. But on the other hand, it started sounding like this fascist regime because it became, at least from the way she was describing it in the UK, of, you know, everything in the UK for the UK. It's like, is this not how Nazism started out? You know, it was a bit freaky. But when you describe it in this like offhanded way or this separated way by reading through this book, which is like a popular hardback, it sounds really great.
Yeah,
I was like, okay, I need to interrogate this because this is not.
It's seductive, isn't it?
It's really seductive, and people really love the idea of a solution to climate breakdown, and this kind of gives it. It's like, oh look, we're doing stuff, we're doing great things, and I was like, I don't know how great that actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say questionable, but I guess that's probably not specific enough. But it's actually, it's almost like it's too simple. Like it's kind of trying to oversimplify something that's completely complex, which I think a lot of your work does really well in talking about how complicated nature is. I know that's a really like weird way of putting it, but nature doesn't fit into national borders or international borders. It doesn't fit into all of these things. So to try and simplify it is sometimes not effective.
Yeah. Well, I think at least one of the things that was going around in my head a lot with that kind of quite nationalistic approach to the Green New Deal in Pettifor's language, at least, was, I mean, I was reading it came out in 2019 and I was reading it in 2020. So I was thinking a lot about Brexit. And as someone who grew up in Ireland, I was thinking a lot about the Northern Irish border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and kind of thinking as well about this contentiousness of nationality and how if you live in Belfast, it can be contentious to say if you're Irish or if you're British. And if all of a sudden you wrap up this climate breakdown solution into your nationality, you're going to cause more issues than solve, I think.
Yeah.
Or let's say you're somewhere like London where most people who live here are not from the UK, let alone from London. So then your nationalism becomes more complicated again. And then like in the UK as well, because it's built up of 4 different nations, or 5 if you count the Isle of Man as a separate nation. It kind of becomes this quite strange thing of like, is this really something that will work here? And then sort of investigating it on like a very localized level. For me, because I was quite interested in like the region of the Irish Sea as this like space that connects and pulls apart 2 islands that are kind of historically so interlinked and then politically so charged, especially right now in like present politics. But I think always, in a way, like countries that neighbor each other, there's always going to be conflict, or a little bit of tension.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of like brings me into my second question loosely, but I was going to ask you why you have chosen to anthropomorphize the Irish Sea. I've come across like various dialogues that criticize human tendencies to anthropomorphize the world. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that.
Yeah. The starting point of a lot of the scripts and the radio plays came from around, I guess, this time last year. I had been spending some time in Ireland and by the Irish Sea on the Republic of Ireland coastline. And I had then come back to London for the first time in a few months. And I started romanticizing the sea in this really, really intense way, which is probably the worst way to start talking about anthropomorphization.
Yeah.
But it started to become this thing where I wanted to try and figure out, like, what would the sea say to me? Or how could the sea speak to me? Or how does it feel about the present moment? This was also, like, in a period of, like, really intense negotiations about an EU border through the sea. I was thinking, what would the sea say to having this border put through it? And part of that kind of became poetry, became bits of text, which each act of the radio play starts with a bit of text. So the beginning of the first act, it talks about being played by people and kind of politicians thinking that it's their current that they can control. Yet as soon as the sea decides to rise, and then the act is literally about sea levels rising, they dangle and cry. So about that kind of element of like control or lack of control.
Their unknown strength, me stooped to one side, yet when I pull up, they dangle and cry.
Part of what I'm interested in giving voice or writing voice for ecological elements, I did another series where I gave voice to the wind, is kind of playing at the conversation between, I guess, bureaucracy and the kind of nature or the ecology it's trying to control. So maybe in this radio play, part of giving voice or anthropomorphizing the sea is to give it a chance to be in this meeting with these politicians or with these like political houses, these parliaments, kind of reintroducing it into that space because it's been left out for so long. And then in the second act, part of it becomes a way to situate the conversation. It's like if you're living on the sea, what happens if you can talk to the thing you're living on and they can talk back to you? It also becomes this quite playful thing as well, because like obviously I can't give voice to the sea. It allows a bit of humor to come into there because there's kind of things that are just a bit weird. But then it also takes us, for me, I feel like the whole thing takes itself a little bit less seriously.
Right.
Because there's a thing of like, this definitely can't be true.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, like, it's the first thing well, not the first thing, but I'd say it's the most obvious signifier that it's a fictional work, basically, isn't it? But also I think there's something interesting that you're doing by kind of trying to put nature into these sort of bureaucratic, very human systems. That's already kind of almost anthropomorphizing nature in itself. And so you're kind of like meeting that system and trying to make it a whole.
Yeah, I guess thinking about like reintegrating things together. Like I did a work last year, which was a fictional email series between where the wind was a representative for this country I made up. And it was speaking to this financial institution that was trying to build wind farms in this fictional country. The idea behind it being, what would the wind say about a wind turbine? You know, how does it feel about wind turbines going through it? And I mean, that's kind of picked up again in this radio play where there's a section of, you know, the sea being stabbed by wind turbines going into the water or going into the bedrock.
And the Deanie wind farm, as though being stabbed, but the knife stayed, and the bleed was fished.
It's trying to start a bit of a conversation around why are we trying to come up with these climate solutions that are relating to how humans should live or how humans feel they can live on the planet, rather than thinking in this kind of broader scope. Yeah, I guess that's part of where the anthropomorphization kind of ends up or like tries to deal with a little bit.
So I was wondering if you could speak about your choice to divide this play into two parts, which are written in very different styles and take place in different settings. I think it's quite an interesting and good choice to have these two different acts, and that also that one is they sort of relate to each other, but they're taking place in completely different times.
Yeah, I mean, so the first act, the Irish Sea Committee, is set slightly closer in the future, maybe is a good way to describe it. I mean, they're both set in kind of indeterminate timescales. Yeah. But kind of going back to what I was talking about at the beginning with the Green New Deal and thinking about politics and kind of how that works in a space like a geographic region like the UK, I wanted to sort of play out politics as they exist now through Parliament houses. So there's 6 characters in that first act. So there's Westminster, kind of for playing like representative of England in a way. Holyrood, which is the Scottish Parliament, Synead, which is the Welsh, Stormont, which is the Northern Irish, and Dáil, which is the Republic of Ireland Parliament. And the Irish Sea as well also comes in and out of that conversation. What I wanted to do in a play was to write conflict. So kind of setting up a little bit of the backstory. So kind of they're trying to deal with rising sea levels, and there's been a wind farm that's in construction, and they haven't had a great conversation with one another. They've implemented their Green New Deals. Kind of, okay, that's like the setting. But all of that background has led them to this moment where they can't talk to each other anymore. And that's kind of what I wanted to do, is to like bring back that like really social element of politics, where it's like, well, what happens if there's just this thing of, oh, you want more money to build this thing, and you want more money because we use money in different ways. It becomes much more human rather than abstract politics. Yeah. Which is kind of what a radio play allowed. And also like having multiple people speak together. I also just wanted to explore script writing a bit more. It was quite...
Yeah, because I said to you, we had a previous conversation about the work, and I was saying how the first act really reminds me of the play 12 Angry Men, where there's like, for those that might not have heard of the play, I'm sure most of you have, it's a play that takes place in one room, and it's a jury who are trying to decide the verdict of, I don't actually remember what the crime was, or even if you find it out. It's been so long ago since I've read it. And the conversation, it starts with, I think, like one jury member thinking that the person is not the defendant. No, is it the defendant? The defendant isn't guilty, and everyone else agrees that the person is guilty. And then throughout the play, basically, they kind of move. You kind of slowly see them move from one verdict to the other through the conversation. And yeah, I felt really reminiscent of that, because I think the play is really successful for that reason. It's sort of just one conversation, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite short in terms of like an actual block of time, but I think that for me, it sort of makes it funny that it's a committee meeting that ends in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, it shows you how terribly it's gone. You know, it ends with all of them saying like, nah, we can't, I don't want to be involved in this. I can't do this. And then it also allows certain, I guess the most interesting thing for me about writing kind of a dialogue between 6 characters is then I get to write 6 different opinions as well. So like Holyrood becomes, I guess, the most ecologically aware character. Like there's a line that they talk about where they say, it's more than just those of us in this room that can decide the fate of the Irish Sea. Whereas the Dáil character is saying, look, they did this before, like it worked really well, like look at the North Sea. I mean, part of the inspiration in that is like the North Sea has been carved up into these different economic zones. It's kind of been carved up in this way that like colonization used to work. It's quite horrific, and it's these really straight lines, and kind of it means that certain parts of Scotland can, you know, build wind turbines somewhere, but once they cross a certain line, that's Norway's water. So I was kind of thinking about how different countries or how different nations kind of relate to their environment. And this isn't like written directly on that. I guess I found it quite funny in like the rewrites how the characters would sort of shift in like if they became more pleasant or less pleasant, or if that was something that mattered. And then even kind of like Sinead becomes this character that's sort of, they're like, why don't we reopen ferry routes? You know, why don't we do this? So there's kind of one character that's more socially aware, one that's more ecologically aware, another that's maybe a little more power hungry.
It would be great to reopen the ferry routes. There are still people with mixed nationalities across the water.
Yeah, there's kind of that dynamic in it in the first act. And then maybe moving to the second part of the question, like Act 2 then was written really differently. So Act 2, I Used to Be So Much More Than Space, is an interview between someone who's a representative of a pirate collective and the Irish Sea, sort of set a bit in the future. So this committee meeting from the first act becomes a historical marker, I guess, in the world that these plays are written in, or these dialogues are written in. And I mean, I think we were talking before, like it's more intimate. It's between like 2 voices. But also part of it was having a way to reveal the world a bit more.
Act 1 is really familiar. Like I very much know what that conversation is. Whereas Act 2, I can recognize that it's intimate, but I'm not so sure I think maybe it's because it's with the sea. It's a intimacy and a conversation that is unfamiliar, or I feel like it's very much placed in your not your imagination, but one's imagination. In Act 1, I'm imagining a room that they're sitting in, and I'm kind of there with them, or I'm a fly on the wall. And then Act 2 is sort of something more poetic, and I think the conversation is, I guess maybe because it's with the ocean, or the Irish Sea, I'm not placed at the committee meeting, and I'm viewing everything, basically. I'm viewing the conversation in more of a dreamlike state, as opposed to an actual environment or a situation. I'm imagining what these kind of pirate towns look like on the sea, and I'm thinking about this person looking out into the ocean, or I'm kind of almost, it's like a montage, basically. I think it's kind of like the visuals to it are more montage like, and maybe in that way becomes more poetic.
Yeah, I think the second act is much looser, partially because there's a non-human voice that has much more, it's given much more space in the piece. But also in a way, because it's farther into the future, there's less, that closeness to the present means that it's harder to know what it's going to be like. I think I was also interested in not putting too many visuals to it because I wanted to use it as a conversation to, I guess, play out some of my concerns with the Green New Deal.
Mm.
So the first act sort of casually mentions it in quite a bureaucratic or almost scientific way. You know, this won't work because it won't work with our Green New Deals, or it won't work with our nationalised schemes.
Mm.
Whereas the second act talks a bit more about what those might be. So, you know, shared workshop spaces that require a certain citizenship, or, you know, taxes on having multiple passports, or, you know, cargo and ferry routes shutting down. So then all of a sudden there's all of these cargo ships that just kind of sit there. And then these people who can't then have this nationalised scheme, they don't fit within it. They're like, okay, well, we'll use what they've discarded.
Mm.
So it's sort of, it starts to play out some of the possibilities, which I guess is what I was kind of interested in, like writing speculative fiction or these kind of science fiction stories, was to play out some ideas like what might happen, how might it look. And then that kind of poeticness as well, I guess, is I didn't want to write the sea or the Irish Sea in this very scientific way.
With the committee meeting taking place, and then the second part, which could be however many years after, you're not so sure, but definitely like things have come a long way since that. You definitely do feel like obviously there's these whole communities of people living in the sea, or not in the sea, but on the sea. A podcast that I was listening to the other day introduced the idea of seventh generation thinking, which is from the Iroquois people, in Indigenous group of people in Canada. And part of the way that they govern themselves is thinking about, or not govern, I guess govern's probably not the right word, but they have this thing called seventh generation thinking, which is thinking about what the world will be like, not in, 100 years, but 7 generations away, which is, I don't even know how many years that is. That's a long time.
Yeah, I'm imagining like 7 by 50.
Yeah.
As like a rough guesstimate.
Yeah. So yeah, around like 350 years.
Yeah.
And now certain governments starting to implicate 7th generation thinking into Japanese government. And so they invite people to come in and actually dress up as if they're however many years from the future. I can't remember. It was like, maybe it's 300 years from the future. And they come and respond to the policies or what is being discussed. And usually people thinking 7 generations away come up with the most practical solutions to any problems that are raised or discussed.
Mm.
And I feel like there's something with what you're doing. I feel like you're sort of using fiction, obviously not in the exact same way, because it's not the committee meeting is also fictional, but there is something that you're responding in that sort of same way. You start with a committee talk, and then you are kind of almost assuming that role of someone who is doing the seven generation thinking.
I think when we started talking and introducing kind of the research of this Green New Deal, and we were saying, well, it doesn't seem like it's very fleshed out. That's part of it, is like fleshing it out, is going farther into the future or speculating what that future might appear to be. I think as well, in terms of the seven generational thinking, there's a sense of being removed from the politics or the bureaucracy of the present. I mean, a little bit of that sort of happens in the second act as well, describing these tools or these ways that the Green New Deal is implemented, and saying, we have these different kinds of guidelines and insurance schemes, and the sea speaking to this person going, what are you talking about? What is green growth? What does that mean? I grow blue. Really tearing apart the bureaucracy and the politics behind it and saying, this is propaganda.
The ILO projects that if countries embrace green growth, 24 million new jobs could be created globally by the year 2030. But the report also predicts that the transition to a green economy will lead to the loss of 6 million jobs in industries related to carbon-based production.
I think part of the interest in like writing fiction or speculative fiction about politics in particular is the sense of political parties using speculation in order to get elected, or using different types of narratives or fiction to maintain power. In a way, that became quite interesting for me. And then kind of generationally, you can sort of see the advantages or disadvantages of that. So, for instance, looking at like in England and the UK in particular, kind of what's the narrative that the Conservative Party tells? You know, how do they talk about how well they're doing and the power that they're maintaining? But if you look at how, for instance, let's say how healthcare looked in the UK 2 generations ago, it doesn't look so good.
Yeah, we had a conversation in our previous podcast, our previous broadcast, about utopias and dystopias. And as you're talking about this, it's making me think about a sort of political speculative fiction that sort of in its everyday practice is actually quite utopic. And to just stay on that side of the binary is, I'd say it's dangerous is like maybe too harsh of a word, but like it's one-sided, I guess.
Yeah, completely. And you know, if you're trying to do something where you're winning a popularity contest, of course you want to sound like you're the best. You want people to believe they can have the utopia. Yeah, exactly. You know, and then you're going to spin that any which way. Part of, I guess, what I finished saying is in 7th generation thinking is that like removal from kind of present political speculation. One of the things that I'm more interested in, though, and part of why the sea is given such a large voice in both of these acts of the radio play, is moving outside of a human span or a human scale of time. So thinking about the sea being almost the same age in both of those acts. Kind of what does that mean? You know, like how can, you know, someone who, or a being that is human, have a conversation with a being that is millennia older than it? Or even something that's unfixed. You know, like the supposed border between, you know, the Irish Sea, and it's kind of bordered by the Celtic Sea on one side and then the North Sea. It's kind of, where does that border doesn't really exist. That's something we've placed on it. So it's even like when you're saying you're speaking to the Irish Sea, like who are you speaking to? Are you speaking to the eastern coast of Ireland? Are you speaking to the west coast of the UK? Are you speaking to somewhere in Wales?
Yeah, it makes me think of that classic thing where they say, like, if you pour a whole jug, or if you put a drop of orange juice or something in one sea, like there's traces of it on the other side of the world, or something like that.
Yeah, there's kind of this complete mass. I guess I was quite interested in the second act and sort of giving a bit of space to that.
So I'll move on to my next question, which is, how does this work relate to the present for you? Or does it relate to the past?
Does it relate to the present? In terms of relating to the present, I guess is something we've kind of touched on a bit, is taking this political idea and playing it through. So showing or trying to show a version of the future where I kind of take the worst case scenario of what this, or not even the worst case scenario, but one scenario of what this type of thinking might do, in order to, I guess, reveal or like make another way to make a decision about what kind of climate policy would be good right now. Because I guess, or one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the urgency of all of this. You know, there is a timeline in terms of how our environment is changing and how the climate is changing, or heating up rather. And on the one hand, it's speculative what kind of +3 degrees will do. But on the other hand, there will be a lot of turmoil because of it and a lot of death because of it, and political leverage as well. So there's a lot of responsibility to think quite quickly about what will happen. And so by playing out a longer version of the future, I hope to sort of create a space to kind of make decision-making in the present, or sort of lead my own decision-making in the present in a more kind of thoughtful way, perhaps.
I should have maybe continued that question, because I was gonna say, obviously your work is not based in the past; it's looking forward, almost in its entirety. But we have had some chats, and there is a lot about piracy in there, and I was wondering how those past stories or facts or knowledge about pirates, in whether it be like 18th century pirates or Somali pirates, how that sort of research or that thinking through those pasts have informed the work.
Yeah, good question. So I think in terms of political drama, I feel like that's quite a historical genre. I mean, just look at 1984 or anything written by George Orwell, really. And then piracy, well, that came out of thinking through, I guess I was thinking about Somali pirates. I didn't go into a lot of research, but I was more so trying to think about what would someone's life be like to become a pirate. So particularly thinking about Somalia and the war there, you know, I think most people would think being a pirate was a much better option.
Yeah.
You know, there was a bit of that thinking, and then using that in the play, or thinking about that while writing this about these pirate collectives in the play. The interview was largely to show, you know, there wasn't other options, or thinking about pirates as people that live outside of perhaps mainstream culture, or who aren't given political space to exist. You know, thinking about pirate radio stations that live kind of outside, or like they're like between two places, and that sort of becomes how they make their thing work, because they're not under any kind of state jurisdiction. Think about piracy as being this quite important act to be able to have space to like question things or disagree with things. And then also what happens when you leave that old system that you didn't have place for? What system do you build to replace that? So like the other kind of background to this pirate story is I was researching areas of the commons. So the commons being any shared resource that is kept and maintained by those who use it. So a commons can be anything from something like Wikipedia to, I don't know, a shared fridge in a household. Like, really, it can be, you can like broaden and shrink your definition of it however way you want. But one of the things I find quite exciting about thinking about the commons is it's a very different way to structure things than democracy, because everyone shares responsibility in a very different way. In democracy, it's like, oh, you lost, too bad. Whereas in the commons, it's like, no, we don't have a sense of losing, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it. And I wanted to use the story of the pirates, where they've left behind this democratic system, and then they've tried to build this commons or these collective systems. I mean, maybe that's a little bit too much density for this broadcast, but
no, I'm just thinking it through. The idea of the commons is an interesting one. Maybe I'm just sat here thinking about pirates. That's my problem. But it's made me think. I mean, so as we've spoken about before, I was watching a documentary about 18th century pirates and how they were quite radical at the time. They kind of put democracy into practice on their ships, and they were these privateers who were kind of left and had no work. And I was doing a bit of research about Somali pirates as well before we had a chat, because I knew that the 18th century pirates is not what interests you. There was, it was funny, I did notice that what these two groups of pirates have in common is that the Navy sort of withdrew Somalian seas. And because of that, there was no regulation of the waters, which is what kind of drove these fishermen to kind of become pirates. And there were people that were hired by the Navy who were kind of left jobless, and they kind of all came together and created these sort of pirate forces, which was similar in the 18th century pirates, where there were privateers who were brought out to the Caribbean, and then the British government had no more use for them, so they kind of banded together and started creating these sort of their own democratic systems. And I guess I'm sort of thinking through that while you're talking about the commons, and I'm thinking about how these groups of people kind of have to create their own commons for themselves.
It's like you've been left behind, so
yeah,
you're trying to, and also usually in that case as well, or at least in the case of this radio play, you've been harmed by that system. That system hasn't done anything for you, which I think is a feeling that a lot of, at least speaking, kind of, we're recording here in London, and there's kind of a feeling around kind of being left behind or not being well served by politics and by government, and even a sense of kind of being sort of disenchanted with it. It's like, well, we can't change it now. And part of writing this story on these pirates, or these pirate collectives, however they want to exist, which I also wanted to leave kind of open because I wanted to leave it to imagination, is showing they've done it. And okay, it's a bit ludicrous because they live on ships in the Irish Sea. Odds are it's going to rust and the whole thing's going to collapse in like 10 years. But for a brief moment, they make this space and they show that it's possible. There's this kind of pocket of that. But, like maybe in those 10 years, something happens on the mainland and they can go back.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of whole thing about the speculation aspect of it. But, making the commons, or like making this like shared resource space was to kind of, in the same thing of like playing out the possible futures of the Green New Deal, which becomes quite dystopic because it's like politics run astray and ultra-nationalism sounds very right-wing, sounds very fascist, all this type of stuff. It's like, okay, but you can find your pocket, and yeah, it's not a utopia, but you're just kind of living in the world. It's not as black and white.
Great. So I think we're actually going to have to wrap it up there, but I obviously had loads more questions to ask you, but this is where we got to. Is there anything last that you'd like to say, bearing that there's no more time left?
No, that's everything. Of course, any more questions or queries, you can always get in touch with us, or you can get in touch with me. We'll have kind of social media handles and all the rest in description. Always happy to hear more questions, answer more questions, hear thoughts and queries.
Great. And our next episode, Niamh and I are actually inviting someone new into our studio. Not so studio. So next month we will be joined by artist Rebecca Romero. So hope to have you guys tune back in next month.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.